we are live.
Okay. Hello, and a big welcome to Biotensegrity Party number 29, brought to you by the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive, where Dorothea, Blostein, and Fernando Tejero will be discussing the archive of the late Tom Flemons, who spent a great amount of time with Stephen Levin discussing some of the technicalities and models in the Biotensegrity concept. My name is Graham Scarr, coming to you from deepest Nottingham in the UK. And I'm joined by my co-host, Susan Lowell de Solorzano, from outside Washington, DC. Hello, Susan.
Hey, Graham.
Thanks.
Hey, everyone.
And Mariana Barreto from Mississauga, near Toronto.
Hi,
Hello,
everyone. Hi, Graham. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Mariana will be disappearing in a moment to handle all the technical stuff of the show. So we're almost ready to begin. But first, let's break open the bubbly and begin the Biotensegrity Party with a toast from one of our guest speakers, Dorothea Blostein.
All right, I would like to propose a toast of Thanksgiving. In Canada, we have Thanksgiving this coming Monday. It's earlier than in the United States because our season is more advanced. And we've here where I am in Ontario, we've had just beautiful fall weather. The sunshine in the fall foliage is just gorgeous. We can always find many things to be thankful for in our lives. So let's toast to that.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers.
And also to Tom Flemons, if I may.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Cheers, Dorothea.
Thanks, Dorothea. Before we move on, let's hear something from Susan about our sponsors who
Thanks,
keep the
Graham.
show running.
All right. So we are grateful for all our sponsors, including Fernando, who's going to be part of the show today. Fernando, his company is Artifact Pro, and the coupon code will be in the chat in a minute to get a discount on his amazing and continually amazing. He's always getting new stuff. His wonderful models, Tensegrity models. And I think we can look forward to even more and more because he's been working a lot with Dorothea. And Handspring Publishing, we want to thank so much. We'll give you their coupon code in the chat as well. Very generous. And I will say that I got word this morning that my book, Everything Moves, is out on Kindle on Amazon US and UK. But if you possibly can, get it through Handspring, because we're trying to really support them. And it's out or will be in the next day or two in the UK, and will be over here stateside, as we call it, completely ignoring Canada and Mexico. And all those other little countries below, right? But anyway, it'll be over in the Americas in about a month. Another sponsor is the British Fashion Symposium that, yes, does happen once every 2 years generally, but they are also going to be coming up with some interesting events. So you want to get on their mailing list and keep track of what they're doing. It's some interesting stuff. And then, of course, Chris Clancy's outfit, Embodied Biotensegrity, that has been with us from the beginning, as has Handspring, and is giving us the technology and has helped us put all this together. Chris and a few, and Rachel and Lisa, our regulars, are all taking Jaap van der Waal's course today, which is wonderful. But that's why they've got the day off. So back over to you, Graham.
Great, thanks, Susan. And I think without any further ado, we'll turn it over to Dorothea Blostein and Fernando Tejero. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Graham. So I'm going to share my screen and show a presentation about the Tom Flemons Archive. So can people see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So my name is Dorothea Blostein. The most important thing for me is to have my email address here. If you have comments or anything you want to discuss, I really enjoy email. So that's blostein@cs.queensu.ca. And I happened, well, here is a video that many of you may have already seen. It's a YouTube video. I never get tired of watching this. Just the wizardry that Tom Flemons had in designing this, just a handful of struts and cables. And he's controlling it by pushing that rod on the top and, you know, skillfully arranging how the model interacts with the ground to show that it makes sort of lifelike looking walking and sitting and turning movements. And it's just, every time I find this astonishing that a model that simple with so few components can do so well in capturing such intricate movements. And I became very interested in how Tom did his designs, and we exchanged hundreds of emails over about a 4-year period. And then I finally thought, the information in those emails is so important, I want to share it. And I knew that unfortunately Tom was in ill health and might not have that much longer to live. And I really wanted his legacy of ideas to be preserved. And so I created the Tom Flemons Archive. And oh yeah, I guess I never started my slideshow here. That's why it was acting funny. Okay, so let's pretend I played that. Okay. So now, as a special start to the talk, though, before I get to discussing the Tom Flemons Archive, I was very interested and excited by the discussion last week between Jean-Claude Gumberteau and Steve Levin. And I think those of you who saw this were probably equally excited. Also noticed that there seemed to be some communication difficulty. So there's a lot of interest in cooperating to develop the Biotensegrity theory, but there was some communication difficulties where Jean-Claude was trying to explain the directions that he thinks Biotensegrity theory needs to be developed. And so here's my attempt to summarize what I understood in that discussion to see if I can help show what the future direction is that Jean-Claude was pointing to. So Jean-Claude was saying that in order to describe connective tissue, we need a theory that includes both irregularity and fractalization. And I think we agree with that. And Steve responded saying we already have that. Biotensegrity theory already includes fractalization. And he showed this, this sort of, or described this sort of fractal representation of the 6-strut tensegrity model. And then that Biotensegrity theory already includes irregularity, and he gave a very nice description of soft matter, bubbles, and foams. And if you have a foam where one bubble bursts, all the other bubbles adjust and change shape in irregular and unpredictable ways. And that seems to be a very nice match to the ever-shifting shapes that Jean-Claude shows in his beautiful videos. But then Jean-Claude was saying, no, there's something missing here. And the things in italics are what I think maybe he was trying to say. So this is my guess. And I think what he was trying to say is that the theory needs to provide both irregularity and fractalization at the same time. And there's a difficulty that currently there's the one part of Biotensegrity theory that models deterministic fractalization of a tensegrity structure. This is entirely deterministic. You have the same tensegrity structure. Every time you make the fractal version of it, it's going to be exactly the same. That's what I mean by a deterministic fractalization. There's no probability or variability there. And then it seems like there's this other part of Biotensegrity theory that models irregularity via foams. And that what we really need to do is to combine the fractalization and the irregularity somehow. So again, this is me putting words into Jean-Claude's mouth, so I'm not sure how accurate it is. But I suggest, for example, can we model a random fractalization of a tensegrity structure? So a way to make this fractal that's going to be different every time, just like biology is different every time, instant to instant? Or can we model tensegrity structures with randomly changing components and changing connectivity? And I have a footnote here about the random fractalization. I don't have time to discuss fractals too much, but definitely decades ago when I read Mandelbrot's book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, I was completely enamored of the concept. And even back then from the beginning, there were these different kinds of methods of making fractal patterns. And I found the Wikipedia entry has some good information in there talking about various degrees of self-similarity. It doesn't have to be perfect self-similarity like it is in this fractalization we have of the Tensegrity icosahedron. And there's various parts of this Wikipedia entry that discuss statistical self-similarity, where you repeat a pattern stochastically so that it's there's some probability involved. So if you're trying to make a computer simulation of it, you would use random number generators and so on. So randomly generated fractals, and there's some enumeration of techniques for generating random fractals using stochastic rules. So there's been a lot of work in this over decades, and I think we for biotensegrity theory, we can benefit from this. And then you can generate fractal models that look like this, that have a lot of irregularity in there. So it's the sort of approximate self-similarity. And I think that sort of thing might make Jean-Claude very happy if we can combine if we can combine the randomness with the fractalization. And so just to conclude this long-winded introduction, because I was so excited about the discussion last week, one way to demonstrate that a theory is well-defined and complete is to create animations based on the theory. And Jean-Claude last week talked about how he had already spent huge amounts of effort making beautiful and interesting animations of various theories he had to try to explain what he was seeing in his beautiful strolling under the skin videos. And he was suggesting or challenging the biotensegrity community to say, please try to make some animations based on your theory. And I think one of the last things he said was, the ball is in your court. So this is the question, the big question in red, I think, for coming months and years for this community is, one of the things we can try to work toward together is, can we create animations based on biotensegrity theory? And that would require combining the concepts of tensegrity, foams, and closed kinematic chains, and other concepts as well. They all have to be combined somehow to make an animation. And I think at present it is quite unclear how to do this. There is exciting and interesting work lies ahead to try to do this, and coming up with animations, even if they're not the best animations in the world and they only capture part of biotensegrity theory, we as a community would learn a lot from doing this, and from the initial clumsy attempts and then better attempts, and eventually it would end up being a very useful way of furthering the development and the popularization of biotensegrity theory. So I would love to have email discussions or discussions about this with people later. What I'm supposed to be talking about today is the Tom Flemons Archive. So let me switch over to that now. So here, on this slide, the text is probably too small for you to read comfortably unless you have a very big screen. But I just have small text to kind of show you a little bit what the archive is like. And I really encourage you to have a look at the archive. This is the URL for it. Just type in intentiondesigns.ca/archive, and your browser will take you there. And what you see at that URL is shown here. There's a little welcome message from me describing that the text in this archive is from emails Tom wrote in the years 2014 to 2018. And also that Tom saw early drafts of this archive and was glad to know that his ideas would be preserved here. And also that he was very sad to not have the opportunity to refine and update this text. So the text is there as it is. Tom was a beautiful correspondent and expressed himself well. And if there's occasional little clumsiness or mistakes or something, I mean, it is what it is. We have his email text and we're very grateful to have that. Sadly, he never had the opportunity to publish a whole well-polished book about this the way Graham and Jean-Claude and other people have published beautiful books. So we have this email text. So the first thing you see in the archive after the welcome message is a table of contents that shows that the archive is divided into these about 8 sections: properties of tensegrity structure, tensegrity biomimicry, and so on. And then there's a preview of some of the images that are available and a place you can click to see the full set of images. There's over 1,000 images. Some of them are duplicates, anyway, there's over 1,000 images, and I have a quick thank you to my former undergraduate student, Niusha Saidi, for uploading all of these images from Google Drive into this website. And then if you scroll down in the archive after this image preview, then you start seeing a more detailed table of contents. So there's properties of tensegrity structures. Like you can click here to go there, to go there directly, or you can then next is tensegrity biomimicry. And in each one of these, there's about half a dozen pages that tell you different aspects of it. And then when you click on a particular page, like here, pretend we clicked on emulate biological systems by modeling force vectors, not anatomy, then you're taken to a different page of the archive that has that title and a brief overview that I created by collecting together some of Tom's sentences. And then it just has, I divided it up into sections and made section headings, and just has text from Tom's emails. So it's just his end of the email conversations, and I'll occasionally put in little italicized comments when you need some context, like that he's answering a certain kind of a question or something. And each entry in the archive just has the date of the email and then his text. So I'll just read this first one because it's a nice introduction. Tom wrote in 2015, "It dawned on me that how tensegrity operated in the body was considerably more subtle and nuanced than I could reasonably expect to model with dowels and elastics. I realized I was probably modeling force vectors and not exact anatomical features with my models, i.e. what it took to build a safe, self-stabilized 2- or 4-legged tensegrity model was pretty much what it must take to stabilize a body in space. Modeling anatomy as a tensegrity should give a rough approximation of what forces and vectors need to be accounted for." And then he goes on in November of that year, what to do about all these files I have. I feel they need annotation so people understand where they fit in the spectrum of exploration. I don't want people to misunderstand and assume these are given forms. They are not. They are explorations with a lot of false starts. It would be easy to criticize them, and so on. So I'm hoping that this interests you in reading some of Tom's own thoughts about his models. And he was certainly constantly experimenting. Every time he finished building a model, he would see its flaws and limitations and have ideas for the next model he wanted to build. And so before I go into covering some of the ideas from his archive, I want to have this little side topic of interdisciplinary communication. We're very fortunate to have these tea parties, and week after week, we're getting a stronger sense of community and very much enjoying interacting with each other. And I think we all recognize that interdisciplinary communication requires goodwill, patience, and also watching out for terminology differences. So I've run across 2 different types of terminology differences I just want to point out quickly. One of them I think we're all aware of is that there are certain technical terms that have a very different meaning in everyday language from the technical definition. So here's two examples that a spider is not an insect. For if you're talking to an entomologist, that's probably so obvious to the entomologist that it would never even occur to him or her to that this would be a confusion. Or steel is more elastic than rubber. If you're talking to a mechanical engineer, again, that's considered obvious, but in everyday language, it's often different. So we need to be aware of some of those differences. And the second kind of confusion that can occur is if you have two experts in different technical fields talking to each other, they can have very specific technical terms that it turns out they have multiple meanings, and it can take a lot of confusing discussion before this finally becomes clear. And it can easily happen that one person thinks, oh, this other person's just such an idiot. You know, what they're saying doesn't make any sense. And really what's happening is just there's a terminology difference. And once you discover this difference, then everything can be cleared up and you can agree on what definition you're using. So for example, a mechanical engineer once told me that he spent weeks arguing about eigenvalues with civil engineers and just having really sort of difficult to understand conversations. And it turned out that these fields just have opposite conventions regarding which axis, the horizontal or vertical axis, is used as the real or the complex axis. And similarly, I had hours of very confusing conversation with a fellow computer scientist. We were talking about graph embedding, and we had two completely different definitions of what graph embedding meant. And it was funny that we talked for about an hour before we figured out that's why our conversation wasn't working. And if I knew coming into the conversation that Jim Cordy was a very intelligent man who I really highly respected. But if I'd had just this conversation, I would have thought, you know, it would be tempting to have to blame it on this other person is not worth trying to talk to when it's really just a communication difference. So now in this presentation, I'm going to include various quotes from the Tom Flemons Archive, and they're annotated with the date of Tom's email and then the name in red of the page in the archive that the quote is from. So if you're interested in reading more of what he wrote in that context, you can find it there easily. So Tom wrote, "I'm perfectly prepared to say that the body behaves like a tensegrity, the map, but not that it is one, the territory. There are structures in the body that may act in ways similar to tensegrities. For example, myofascial tensional meshes that wrap joints perhaps can be compared to helical tensegrity masts. But the complex chaotic wrapping of fascia over and around joints looks nothing like a tensegrity mast. I'm abstracting out tensegrity principles that might account for how joints can float. Also, I think I made a good discovery that the structure of the pelvis bears a close resemblance to an octet truss." Here's an image of an octet truss. "Yet no one has ever made any comment on this. I can see the pattern, but then I'm a geometer and there don't appear to be any anatomists or biomechanists that are trained in geodesic math. So no one has recognized the implications. I could write a whole paper on the implications, but who would understand it if they can't see hidden structure?" And reading this sort of thing makes me quite sad that Tom is no longer with us to join in these tea parties, because I think he would find that, yes, there are anatomists and biomechanists who are either trained in geodesic math or willing to learn about geodesic math, and he would really enjoy having conversations and discussions about these insights and ideas he's had, like that the structure of the pelvis bears a close resemblance to an octet truss. And I put this quote here because it's related to communication, that Tom was very concerned that people were taking his models too literally and trying to say the body is a tensegrity structure, or it is like that his models should be used as a simile, not as a metaphor, to say, it looks kind of similar, but not that it is a tensegrity structure like that. So on the topic of terminology, what do we call Tom's work? Tom wrote to me about this in May 2016. I get Google alerts on Tensegrity and Biotensegrity daily, and from the results that pop up can clearly see where this is headed. Rather than being a scientific endeavor, it has become an almost meaningless piece of jargon. Without a definition, there's no way to grasp the concept or use it productively. So again, it's too bad that Tom is no longer with us to join the tea parties. He would have really appreciated Susan's efforts in Biotensegrity number 23, where she made a beautiful little video defining and distinguishing tensegrity versus biotensegrity versus applied biotensegrity. And so one thing we can ask is, what do we call Tom's work? And I would say it falls in the framework of tensegrity. It's not directly biotensegrity or applied biotensegrity. And what I suggest is that we use the same terminology Tom used himself describing his work. So his work is tensegrity biomimicry, and he creates biomimetic tensegrity structures. And these structures can be used to illustrate or explore biotensegrity ideas. So these bold-faced tensegrity biomimicry and biomimetic tensegrity structures, those come from these quotes and others that Tom wrote in October 2015. Borrowing from life to solve technical problems is biomimicry. And I recognized that my models could simulate anatomy without necessarily looking like it. I think robotics and prosthetics will benefit from this approach, and I call this tensegrity biomimicry to distinguish it from biotensegrity concerns, which are different but obviously related. And then Tom and I did have the opportunity to write a conference paper together. This was for the ASCE Earth and Space Conference. It was on space robotics. And we wrote a co-authored a paper, New Approaches to Mechanizing Tensegrity Structures. And that's where Tom used this adjective biomimetic, which at first, that was the first time I ever saw that word, but it's just biomimicry turned into an adjective. And he wrote, employing biomimetic modeling has allowed the creation of relatively simple, i.e. non-fractal tensegrity models that capture force transmission patterns in human and animal movements. And then he went on describing how this would be relevant for space robotics, because that was the audience we were writing for. The last thing I want to talk about on the topic of terminology is, what do we call this structure here? When I started corresponding with Tom, I was kind of overwhelmed at his incredible passion and vehemence and saying this needs to be called the expanded octahedron tensegrity, and he would abbreviate that X-octa, expanded octahedron. And it's a total mistake to call it a tensegrity icosahedron. And I was just kind of saying, okay, I'm new to this whole field, I'll call it whatever you want, okay. And I didn't really understand what was going on. But since in this biotensegrity community, the terminology of tensegrity icosahedron seems to have won out, I thought I should at least let Tom speak to us from the grave about why he thinks that it should be called an expanded octahedron tensegrity. And I'm pretty sure that Tom got that terminology from the book by Pugh, 1976, An Introduction to Tensegrity. So Pugh said it should be called an expanded octahedron tensegrity, and Tom went with that. So just to read what he wrote about this, because every time I say the term tensegrity icosahedron, I feel a little bit guilty, sorry, Tom, I hope I'm not, letting him down. So he says, I think what everyone is referring to as a tensegrity icosahedron, which is then made the centerpiece of the biotensegrity argument, is not an icosahedron. I'm referring to the classic 6-strut tensegrity, which is in effect based on octahedral geometry. It is technically an expanded octahedron tensegrity. the three axes of the octahedron, which pass through opposite vertices, are doubled and pulled apart by the tension system into an expanded octahedron. The nature of the geometry is such that it never reaches the icosahedral symmetry. The distance between two parallel struts is one half the length of the struts, whereas the distance along any one of the tension members is 0.6124. It's true that if you pull two parallel struts away from each other and the tensegrity has a bit of elasticity, then the proportions of the icosahedron are achieved momentarily, but it's worth noting that the force required to achieve this has to come from outside of the tensegrity. Here's one of the few places where I think Tom has a little mistake in his writing. He says that the tensegrity has to have a bit of elasticity. I don't think that's required at all. It's just inherent in the geometry of the tensegrity, no matter how much pretension it has, that you will be able to pull it apart into the icosahedral symmetry. So I did a little bit of Google search for expanded octahedron tensegrity to see which communities use that terminology rather than calling it a tensegrity icosahedron. And for example, I found this 2019 paper from some mechanical engineering journal, the International Journal of Solids and Structures, called Octahedron Family, the Double Expanded Octahedron Tensegrity. And this is an image from this paper where they start with an octahedron tensegrity where actually the struts would be intersecting each other. And then the expanded octahedron, which is just this one here. And then, so it has 6 struts and 24 cables, doubling the octahedron. And then the contribution in this paper was that they found this double expanded octahedron where you again double it and have 12 struts and 48 cables. And the paper is full of zillions of equations analyzing the minimum energy state of this thing. And nowhere in the paper they mention that the octahedron and expanded octahedron tensegrities are well known and have been studied, and their contribution is this new one. And nowhere in the paper do they even mention that anyone else would ever call this a tensegrity icosahedron. So they're in this community, they just call it the expanded octahedron. So I don't think it matters that much what we call it, but it's interesting to at least know Tom's point here that this 6-bar tensegrity has been referred to so often as a tensegrity icosahedron that the mistake is embedded in common usage now. In fact, it is not an icosahedron and its properties are quite other than icosahedral. This is not a moot distinction because a lot depends on proper definition and assumptions. There is no force acting from within the structure that can force it to assume an icosahedral geometry. So here again, I'm trying to repeat what I think are very interesting emails Tom wrote to me, and I don't fully understand them. I'm sad that Tom is no longer with us. I would like to ask him what he's referring to when he says the properties of the structure are quite other than icosahedral. Like, what properties does he mean and how are they different? I honestly don't know. There may be some answers to this in Pugh's book. I never got around to reading that book. But again, I feel like I'm just a messenger here, trying to put out some of Tom's ideas, and maybe other people understand better what he's referring to. And if you have interesting ideas or concepts that you think could be added as annotation to the archive, please email me and I would be happy to put them in. On the topic of this 6-strut model, I thought I would just briefly mention some work that one of my students did. My master's student, Adrian Murasan, was simulating, so he was writing computer code because I'm a computer science professor and supervise students doing that sort of thing. So he was writing code to simulate how a tensegrity structure moves to a stable state. And so he was testing out a software, and the software is told what connectivity to use. So here it would be told there's 6 struts and 24 cables, and strut number 1 has the one end of strut number 1 has a cable that connects it to an end of strut number 2, and just what the connectivity is. So here there's 6 struts and 24 cables, and 4 cables connect to each strut end in that configuration. then the software chooses random starting positions for the struts, and then just does physics simulation where it moves each strut end just a little bit in the net direction of cable pull, and just keeps doing that until there's no more movement, and then it means the structure has reached a minimum energy stable state. And most of the time when he did this, he would end up with this configuration that we're so familiar with. But once he got this result, and he was trying to figure out, is this a mistake in the software or not? And so he just took his model that he had built of the 6 strut, I'll call it a Tensegrity icosahedron, sorry, Tom. And he found that indeed this is a stable state, and with the same connectivity as in that configuration, you can make it look like this, this shape. To go from one shape to the other here, he needed to unhook and rehook 3 of the cables. So in this model that he made, there's little hooks and eyelets at the end of the cable, so you can unhook 3 of them to be able to shift the struts around to go from this shape to this shape. And this one right here reminded me of, I'd seen in Graham Scar's beautiful website where he had many beautiful pictures of different tensegrity structures. It reminded me a little bit of the T6 prism, but this one is different. The T6 prism has 6 struts and 18 cables. So there's 3 cables at each strut end, and this one has 4 cables at each strut end. And so I just thought I'd mention this briefly, since the Tensegrity icosahedron has been studied so much. I don't know if or where it would be relevant to know that it does have this other stable configuration. Okay, so moving on now to the contents of the archive. I think everyone in this audience is already aware that it's an incorrect simplification to say struts are bones, cables are fascia, and this is a direct model of anatomy. Just looking at this series of images of different leg and foot models that Tom created, it's obvious that the struts are not bones. Like, you know, we don't have this many bones in our legs. So the struts generally capture compressive, or in the model, they represent all compressive forms and forces in the body. So compressive forces in bones and fascia, as well as hydrostatic pressure. And the cables are tensional forces in bones, fascia, extracellular matrix, intercellular matrix. And these models, of course, are limited. They don't have any analog to muscles or nervous system or circulatory system or immune system. So it's important not to take these models too literally, or you know, try to read too much into them, but to appreciate that they do an amazing job of capturing some interesting aspects of force transmission, given that it's just a few dozen struts and cables. And Tom wrote very interesting comments here. You can read more about it in Emulate Biological Systems by Modeling Force Vectors, Not Anatomy. And he writes about limitations of his modeling, that he figured out that he shouldn't try to model anatomy too exactly. And instead, I hope to abstract out the essential geometry in any pelvis and to derive an optimal form that I can plug into a kinematic tensegrity system. Properties such as symmetry, chiral organization, point bonding, edge bonding, and face bonding, and optimal actuation are of more interest than descriptors such as torsos, legs, and arms. And obvious applications include platforms for prosthetics and robotics, but also exoskeletal skeletons and wearable suits for hostile environments such as space or deep sea diving. I have 2 videos to show here. This one, many of you have probably seen. It's been on YouTube for a long time. This one here is available in the archive. I don't think Tom ever put it on YouTube. And here you can see some of the changes in Tom's thinking from 2012 to 2016, how he was trying to model the knee in particular. He was always looking for ways to model that the knee can bend in one direction, but not the other. And had in this 2016 model, I think he achieved that more completely than in this 2012 model. And it's very interesting again these videos are good to see multiple times and compare them and try to learn from them and then try to imagine, okay, what would Tom have done next if he had been able to live longer? Now I want to talk about triangulation. So triangulation was a very important concept to Ken Snelson. I highly recommend this picture essay that Ken Snelson wrote. It's called Tensegrity Weaving in the Binary World, and here's the URL for it. If you just type the title, Tensegrity Weaving in the Binary World, into a browser, I'm sure you'll find it. Unfortunately, it has no date of publication. I'm sure it was published after 2012 because there is on one page of this article, Ken refers to some other thing that happened in 2012. So this was near the end of his life. He published this and it has very interesting discussion of his views on triangulation and various other things. So Snelson's beautiful sculptures are fully triangulated. That means they sway in the wind, they're good for modeling plants. And the reason that triangulation was so important to Tom was that he recognized that he wanted to create tensegral joints. So a joint in a tensegrity structure that might act a little bit like an elbow or a knee or a hip or whatever. And anytime you want to have a joint like that, you need to have a break in the triangulation. If the structure is fully triangulated like this, the only sort of movement that it can make is to sway in the wind and to model plants. But so Tom worked tirelessly and with great ingenuity to try to design various kinds of tensegral joints, revolute joints, universal joints, sliding joints, and so on. So Tom in his emails wrote to me a lot about triangulation, and I was trying to figure out, what do you mean by triangulation of a tensegrity structure, or what did Ken Snelson mean by it? And I'll just say briefly, it happens that I grew up with triangulation in the house. When I was a young teenager, my father, Wolfgang Haken, who's actually a pretty famous math professor now in retirement, he's working on physics, but he's my father, and he was one of the people who proved the Fourcolor theorem, which was a famous theorem in mathematics because people had been trying to prove it for 100 years and thought they had proofs, and then other people would find mistakes and so on. And in that proof, they used a lot of little triangulation figures like this. So when I was a kid, we had the house covered with these things and we were trying to look for duplicates and so on. And so I grew up hearing about planar triangulations and learning that if you have V vertices, E edges, and T triangles, you have these two equations. The first one is pretty obvious, that every triangle has 3 edges, but each edge participates in 2 triangles. So the number of edges you have is 1.5 times the number of triangles. And then there's this other one, Euler's formula, which has lots of different proofs you could find on the internet, that says the number of vertices minus the number of edges plus the number of triangles is always equal to 2 for planar triangulations. Anyway, this came to me eventually, and I figured out, hey, I can use this to compute if a tensegrity structure has full triangulation. If it has S struts, I can compute how many cables it will take to make a full triangulation. So if you want to know how I derived it, it's over here. The other things we add is that obviously in a tensegrity structure, the number of edges is, each edge is either a strut or a cable. And each strut has 2 endpoints where things attach to make vertices. So just combining that and doing a little bit of algebra, which I know everyone here loves, you can come up with this equation here. So it tells you, for example.
Sorry, Dorothea, will you just say, this is Susan, will you just tell us your father's name again? I think that was really interesting.
Wolfgang Haken. So just like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, I mean, it's German. So I grew up speaking German at home. His name is Wolfgang Haken.
Thank you.
Yeah, his first love was physics. He's, for the past 25 years since he's been retired, he's been making a cosmology theory because the Big Bang theory obviously has huge problems in it. and doesn't have global conservation of energy. So he's making an alternative cosmology theory that has global conservation of energy in a non-expanding universe. And he's 93 now, and I read his theories with interest and try to be the one person who's paying attention to what he's writing down. Oh, okay, so back to this, just looking at the expanded octahedron tensegrity, or in this talk, I need to call it expanded octahedron out of respect to Tom Flemons, but the thing that we've been calling the Tensegrity icosahedron, it has 6 struts and 24 cables. 6 times 5 is 30, minus 6 is 24. That's a completely triangulated structure. The 3 prism, which would be one of these modules, has 3 struts and 9 cables. Again, 3 times 5 is 15, minus 6 is 9. And then this tower of 3 modules, this comes from page 22 of this article, where Ken Snelson describes how to take 3 of these 3 prism modules and combine them into a tower by adding these 6 red lines and these however many blue lines and so on. If you just count up the total number here, it has 9 struts and 39 cables. Again, that matches this 5 times 9 is 45, minus 6 is 39. So I was happy at least that I'd come up with this one way to test that if a tensegrity structure with S struts does not have this many cables, then we know for sure it's not fully triangulated. It was still interesting. It's not necessarily, I asked Tom, if, I just go back to this thing. I asked Tom, okay, this one is fully triangulated. This one has the same number of struts and cables, but in this other position, would you consider this fully triangulated? And he said, no, because it has this hexagon shape at the bottom that's not triangulated. So I feel like I never really fully understood exactly what Tom meant by triangulation, but it's pretty clear he thought a lot about it. And you can see the things like these tensegrity structures that only kind of sway around but don't have tensegral joints are fully triangulated. Okay, so I think, yeah, I'll try to finish up in about 10 minutes or so. So Tom's, one of his huge contributions was this modular approach to tensegrity design, where he was trying to come up with, you say you have various modules and you can think of each module itself might be fully triangulated and have fairly high pre-stress. So it's a pretty stable thing. And then you need to have ways of combining several modules together in a tensegral way. You don't just want to, make straight levers or weak joints that are going to break. So you want to have tensegral linkages. And so you can find out, if this interests you, I encourage you to study the archive, both the images and the text. For example, here's an illustration of what he calls Big Puppy, where he's using these X modules as struts, and then has color-coded the tension lines. The dark blue he calls saddle string slings. The turquoise ones he calls longitudinal control lines, and there's red and purple horizontal and vertical cross-link control lines. He has other pictures like here towards a tensegrity biped. He was always trying to improve on full body models. And here you can see in black, he's showing various modules, and then with his suggestions with the red, how to make various linkages for this. And one of his big interests was also that if you wanted to make an actuated tensegrity structure where you put in some motors so that on the fly, the tensegrity structure can change the resting length of certain cables and move that way, that this would provide a really interesting way and an efficient way to create actuation, that you would only need to put motors on the red cables. You wouldn't need to change the lengths of the cables that are parts of the modules, and only these ones that control the joints could get motors on them to make this thing be able to walk on its own computer control to coordinate the motors. He was also very excited at the possibilities of this bistable joint that he came up with in the last few years of his life. Here's two photos of the same model where the transition between these two states uses rotation along 3 axes. And this model is very stable in either this position or this position, but in between, if you put it in some in-between state, it's going to flip into either this or this position. And he was very excited about many possibilities for this. For me as a computer scientist, as soon as I see something like this, I say, oh, anything that's bistable 0 and 1, we can make a computer out of this, you know, and computer memory and all sorts of things. But he thought that this would have many interesting applications. So we also talked a lot about the software support that Tom would like to see, because he was using software called SketchUp, like, for example, this big puppy thing he made in SketchUp. And SketchUp is purely a drawing package. SketchUp does not have any physics simulation in it. It doesn't know anything about tensions and cables or resistance and struts, or so it will never be able to simulate how anything moves. So Tom could just kind of eyeball things, how he thought they could go, and just make a drawing program. But he was very interested in the possibilities of having better computer support to help him more quickly explore different possibilities, because it takes a long time when he has an idea and then he's trying to think of how to build it. It takes a long time to build it, and you could explore more possibilities with computer software. So we talked a lot about how it would be great if the software could just have a library of Tensegrity modules you could choose from, like these modules here, and then a menu of Tensegrill linkages, so that the user could say, oh, I want to take one of these and connect it with, and Tom had all these evocative names for his Tensegrill linkages: face-to-face bonding, struts kissing, revolute joints, universal joints, sliding struts, interpenetrating modules. You can read about all of these in the Tom Flemons Archive. There's one page of the archive that's called Simulation Could Help, where there's a lot of Tom's text about what he would like to see in software support. And there's other pages of the archive devoted to these Tensegrill linkages with illustrations and so on. So I have 2 more videos here to take a brief break. This one on the left shows telescoping appendages, and this one on the right shows another Tensegrity pelvis and spine, where again he was really working about interesting ways, you know, how do you connect this spine portion to this pelvis portion in a way that makes a good linkage. So again, if you wanted to see these videos again and in more detail, they're on the archive. Okay, so fractal models I already talked about in my new second slide, so I think I'll just move through this very quickly. If you want to read about these fractal models, it's on the archive page called Fractal and Membrane Structures. And Tom just wrote about how, in his view, one of the very interesting things about these fractal models was that you could use them for actuation, that if you wanted to add motors to change the shape of this overall expanded octahedron tensegrity, you could actually change the shapes of in this case, the struts. You could make the struts, they could become bent or change shape in various ways because they're fractal structures. So, and so he says it's just another way of thinking about how to actuate a tensegrity linkage, and how it was really taxing his computer to create this image here with 3 fractal levels. I don't know if you can see that there, but you can zoom into the images in the archive. Tom wrote a lot about construction techniques. Now this presentation is taking me a bit too long, so I'll move through this quickly. But if you look at the archive page on rapid prototyping, he has illustrations and discussions of his prototyping method, and writes that over the last 30 years, I have invented and perfected a means to rapidly prototype tensegrity forms. And that this he describes how this allows him to be fairly quick in building pretty elaborate constructions without needing to take accurate measurements or spend hours trying to figure out what goes where and how to keep it all together and exactly how long all the cables need to be and so on. And I just found it was interesting in his own assessment. He says, frankly, I think this could be my contribution to furthering the field of tensegrity exploration. So he felt that, you know, it had taken him decades of exploration on construction techniques to come up with this approach, and it would clearly worked well for him. He came up with many beautiful and interesting models doing this. And he also describes the limitations of this rapid prototyping, that he just picks what length of struts he wants and then has to guess at the length of the elastics. And if he guesses good enough, then the structure is relatively stiff. And if he guesses wrong, then it's a failure. He has to start over. He can't finish building the model because the tension is too high, or because it's so floppy that it just collapses, and because the tension is too loose. And he was always dreaming up ideas for better ways to do tensegrity construction. So you can find very interesting drawings, again, on the rapid prototyping page and elsewhere, for strut caps, and here for tensegrity end fitting with 10/32 thread cuts to screw into blah, blah, blah. I'm not that familiar with reading these kinds of diagrams. People who have more engineering and drawing background than I do would understand them. So then, as part of his frustrations with the limitations he had with his rapid prototyping technique, in particular that the models were just too floppy, so he was not able to build full body tensegrity structures with high enough pretension to really work well, and he needed better construction techniques. And so again, on the archive page, adjusting pre-stress, high pre-stress, you can read about his thoughts on this and see some more suggestions he had, like this collet lock here, where you would need a conical hole in the strut end to fit this collet, and so on. Or here he had this idea for this 3D printed end cap, and said this could be used with spectra cord, which is 15 times stronger than steel at the same weight. And so he was full of plans. It's really a big loss to us that he's no longer with us to build on side, to show us what sort of designs he could come up with if he was able to make higher pre-stress models. I have two more little videos before I get to the last topic I want to cover here. This presentation is a bit long. So this tensegrity mast is actually on YouTube. It's one of my favorites. It's so funny how he controls this. There's 3 lines that go through the middle of the mast, and he's pulling on them under the table to make this thing jump around and have a little fit and throw stuff. I just love his models. Okay, so the last topic I want to talk about briefly here is, this is terminology I just made up to call these snapshot tensegrities. So I'm calling all these models here snapshot tensegrities because it's a static structure. It's just sits there and is a beautiful tensegrity structure. And it's very interesting to see how it moves in response to external forces, but on its own, it just sits there. So it's at best sort of a snapshot of a human body, or an aspect of a human body. Most existing tensegrity modeling that's been done, for example, Ingber, Flemons, and Scar, use snapshot tensegrity structures. Like obviously Don Ingber recognized that the cytoskeleton is always constantly changing, the microtubules and microfilaments and whatever change length and connectivity and move around. But the tensegrity models that he actually built were just snapshots. And we just have to be careful when we're trying to explain biotensegrity to people and using snapshot tensegrities as illustrative models. We have to be constantly aware that the lack of adaptation makes this highly limited as an analogy for biological systems. And we have to be careful not to confuse the person we're talking to by showing, hey, look how this can move. It's not really capturing how a human body moves according to biotensegrity theory, because the theory recognizes that in the human body, the tensegrity structure is changing all the time, moment to moment. So I just wanted to talk about the only sort of moving tensegrity structures that we've had a lot are these actuated ones in robotics, like the NASA Superball bot. This is a very interesting video, but well, okay, so you can see this video on Superball version 2. So they built a Tensegrity icosahedron or expanded octahedron Tensegrity. And it has a motor in each cable. So here, for example, they can relax all the cables and then the thing folds flat for transport, which is fantastic for, space exploration. You can have these things folded flat and put a bunch of them in, have redundancy, put a bunch of them into a spaceship. And then when you're ready to deploy them, then they can unfold. And they also show durability of this thing. Here they're throwing it off a NASA building and it just bounces around, and you can have a payload like a camera or some fragile equipment suspended in the middle of this structure, and it will be shielded from blows. Now, this is how they get this thing to move. And so this, Tom Flemons described this movement as saying what they're doing is deflating and reinflating the triangulation. They loosen some cables, so it starts falling in the direction of one of the struts that's touching the ground, and then they reinflate the triangulation behind it. So Tom said, this works, but it's not very energy efficient. It's kind of like we would think it was silly if you tried to move a bicycle tire or a tire by taking the air out in the front and putting the air back in the back. So Tom was always interested in coming up with better and more efficient ways of actuating tensegrity structures where you don't lose as much energy as you do here with this deflating and reinflating the triangulation. If you're interested in that topic, you can look at this paper we co-authored, New Approaches to Mechanizing Tensegrity Structures. You can find it on the archive. So I made up, just this week, I made up the term snapshot tensegrity and the term morphing tensegrity. If people have better terms to suggest, I'd be glad to hear them. But I think we need to investigate morphing tensegrities, and this gets back to what Jean-Claude Gumberteau was asking the community to do. If we can somehow model morphing tensegrity structures that are constantly changing the property, not just the properties of struts and cables like length and stiffness, we can already do that with these actuated tensegrity structures. But the morphing tensegrity structure can change the number of struts and cables and the connections between struts and cables. And that would provide a much more complete analogy for biological systems, but one that still should not be taken too literally. Okay, so I'm running too long, so I think, well, I just have this is my second to last slide, which I think I'll just put up and briefly show you because this is such a hilarious video. So this obviously is not tensegrity. This is to illustrate evolutionary computing used for gait discovery. And they start with these blocks and muscle body models that are, I just think it's just so funny looking at these different generations where the body models are always collapsing on them, but they use evolutionary computing to pick the ones that happen to be doing well and let them survive to the next generation, and then try to discover ways that they can control the movement of these structures by controlling the simulated muscles. I'll stop that one and show that similarly evolutionary computing has been used by NASA again for gait discovery for these things they call tensegrity snakes. Tom took offense at that, saying these aren't really tensegrity structures. You can kind of see that they don't have enough cables in them to really be called tensegrity structures. If you were to pick up one of these snakes, it would just be really floppy. It doesn't have enough tension network to be self-stabilized. But still, it's interesting how they find ways if you actuated these things. So you had motors in certain of the cables, you can discover different gates that it can use to move. So I think for the future, it would be possible maybe to take this evolutionary computing approach, but allow it to also not just look at the actuation of the tensegrity structure here, but also allow it to change the number of struts and cables or the connectivity of struts and cables. Or the other approach you could take for simulating morphing tensegrities is to simulate homeodynamics with adaptation rules. I won't repeat that. I made a presentation about that at Biotensegrity party number 26 with this little publication, and also this 2001 paper by Lloyd et al. About homeodynamics. And then I'd written about some of this stuff to Tom. So to end with this quote here, as to your ideas regarding modeling dynamic homeostasis and its use in clinical applications, I have an idea of how this might work. I envision a method whereby a complex enough tensegrity map of the body could be superposed on top of a 3D scan of an actual person. And then subtle distortions and imbalances in the body would transfer to the model, and using force vector analysis would disclose a global map of the tension matrix. 30 years of building and balancing complex tensegrity models have suggested to me the possibility that a similar approach might apply to clinical interventions to correct restrictions and dysfunction in the body. So I thought this was just a very interesting idea. And again, you can look at the archive page called Tensegrity and Body Work to read his full text about this. So now my last slide here, final remarks. The big open goal that Tom really was wishing for was to create a full body tensegrity model with adequate pre-stress. And having that would have so many uses in bodyworks, robotics, tensegral crash test dummies, etc. The closest Tom got was this model that he called Albert, and he just loved and has many photos of it. And it was something that he built, I think, more like 6 or 8 years before the end of his life. And he's envisioned many improvements for it, but never had the materials and time to build it. So please explore the archive, and again, email comments to me here. I want to end with 2 more quotes from Tom, because I think they're just so interesting, and he's not here to speak himself. So from November 2015, he says, when I contacted Steve Levin in the late 1990s, my immediate interest was, of course, to see if a consistent and plausible argument could be made for representing structural anatomy as tensegrity structures. It seemed to me that while the fractal nature of tensegrities was well understood by then, the leap from cell tissue organ systems to complete anatomical structures seemed a possible difference in kind rather than just degree. Livers, for example, do not have joints, so a modeling system that describes pneumatic and hydrostatic structures like tensegrity may be a good fit. But when it comes to articulating structures, a new kind of description is needed. A joint in a tensegrity is a failure of the envelope, a disjoint, as Jaap van der Waal points out. Making tensegrities that articulate without going into failure is a major challenge. And we miss Tom. We're very grateful for his many ideas. I think his major contributions to tensegrity design are his modular approach, where you have the highly pre-stressed, fully triangulated modules, and then different kinds of tensegral joints to join them together without going into failure. And the last thing, the last quote we have here is, I just found, again, very interesting visionary statement from Tom. He's writing about the need for levers with floating fulcrums. There is no difference between skeleton and Snelson tensegrities in terms of levers. Heterarchies and hierarchies really make my argument. Levers are acting at all fractal levels in heterarchical and hierarchical ways. I suggest we call them potential levers and contingent fulcrums. For a tensegrity to articulate or hinge across a joint, some portion of it becomes identified as the lever, and the rest of the structure substitutes for the fulcrum. We can constitute levers of any length in the body depending on what is needed. If we need to reach for something, the lever becomes an extension of the arm, shoulder, torso, or opposite leg, depending on how far we have to stretch and how much the object weighs. The rest of the body functions as the extended fulcrum for the purposes of any specific motion. Using this argument saves the science and math of 500 years of biomechanics and updates it with tensegrity principles. So that's my introduction to the Flemons Archive, and I will now stop screen sharing. And maybe Fernando wants to say something brief, and then we can hopefully have a little bit of discussion.
Yes, thank you, Dorothea. I would like to thank you for such a nice presentation and amazing travel through the archive. It was really amazing. So thank you for this amazing presentation. I didn't get, of course, to meet Mr. Tom Flemons. Was living in Canada and I am located in Spain. But I start building the icosahedron or the expanded octahedron on 2014. And while I was checking on the internet, I found on 2014 October, I found Tom Flemons' work in the Intention Designs.ca website. And I was amazed by his work. So I always thought, and I think, that Mr. Flemons' work, the structures and wisdom must be at all schools, universities of movement courses at all levels, from yoga, Pilates teachers to medical surgeries and cardiorespiratory doctors. Also, of course, from physiotherapists, osteopaths, and movement teachers around the globe. So when I see on December 2014, I think it was, that I saw on his page that he was stopping of building tensegrities. So I couldn't believe it. And I decided to write him to check what was the possibilities for me, because as I was telling you, I was building the Tejero, and I wanted all of the models from Flemons. So he replied me back, and he encouraged me to build the 6 struts model that I already got built, that I didn't say to him. And he was giving me exactly details about how he was building his icosahedrons. Also, he encouraged me to buy the Introduction to Biotensegrity from Anthony Pack, the book that Dorothea just quoted before. It's a book that has the copyright from 1966, so 1976. So it's a 44 years old book. And I think it's still the best comprehensive manual to build tensegrities. So I decided, because he said to me that he was busy developing some robotics models, and that he was working with NASA with some robotics projects. So I keep on building, and I decided to build my own pelvises and my own spines. And once I was satisfied with the development and the behavior of the spine and the pelvis, I decided to write back to Tom and show him my advances, and also for asking for more advices. And since I wanted to keep going with the development of more difficult tensegrities. I remember I mentioned him on this second email. This second email was like the beginning of January 2016. So I was like for a whole year building these 2 models. I asked him on that email, I mentioned it about the leg. And can you believe that he took, this wise man, he took his time without knowing me at all to briefly explain to me what are his solutions to build a leg, and why he chose that kinds of solutions, and also gave me some important features to abstract out to model the road of a tensegrity foot, just the tensegrity foot. I asked him for the leg, for example, but he gave me the briefly information for the foot. And so what I want to say is this incredible man, without knowing me at all, he was a generously inspirational and encouragement person. What Mr. Flemons leaves behind is a treasure. It's an interconnected ideas and experiments of a visionary that as a brilliant science would insist on precisely defining words and ideas. He was always thinking and getting new paths, getting new solutions for his models, solving and recreating new ideas. And with every new idea, he will develop a new model. And with that, a new model, new ideas flourished. He had a fertile mind and a fruitful execution of designs. He wasn't just a brilliant thinker. He could create things. He could create amazing and unbelievable models such as Tensegrity dragons, or for example, the Albert Tensegrity man, or just the leg Tensegrity model that I was saying to you before. They are for me an artistic work of engineer. Or he could also imagine the Scowish toy, which is a clever and unique and iconic toy in worldwide distribution that has touched some 5 million infants. So I highly recommend you to get into the website and dive in all these pictures, quotes, papers, resources, designs, and models, and also to enjoy an experience with the archive that Dorothea has deeply and carefully organized and interrelated the ideas, the pictures, the emails, the contents, and conversations about several aspects, techniques, examples, applications, and other interesting information surrounding Tensegrity structures, Tensegrity designs, and Tensegrity models. I would like to thank and congratulate Dorothea for the spectacular and unsurpassable work. It's a pleasure to move through the archive and between the different documents and plenty pictures. Since after the email of 2016, I got already developed the pelvis and the spine. So I decided to go on, and that's how I ran out Artifact Pro, in which, inspired by Mr. Flemons' work and Mr. Flemons' models, we developed Tensegrity models for whatever wanted to have one. And I would like to show you some of them that they look nearly the same. I don't know if you can see here. I prepare like a kind of a stage for the models. So let me just put the camera here. Let's start with the teicosahedron. You know it, of course. It's a regular one. I build them with the elastic cords. You know, the regular Tensegrity has no elastic cords, but because Mr. Flemons was building like that, I start with the elastic cords also. Here you have the representation of the pelvis, the first pelvis that we made. We've seen in the Zoo model, Tensegrity, Biotensegrity party. I don't remember the number. But for example, this one is really good to show how, for example, a jump needs to pre-charge and to bend the knees to pre-charge the tendons and the muscles. And then when they get released, the pelvis will jump. Okay, and it shows several movements or several pathologies around the pelvis and the legs. We also build, of course, everything based on Flemons' models, our own spine, that as you see, they float, all the vertebrates, they float like with a little magic, but it's not magic, it's Tensegrity. And well, Mr. Flemons used spheres as the vertebrates' bodies, but we put cubes. is just inspired by him, but we try to find our solution. I have here what we call Proteus, which is like a kind of torso. All this, you know, you can see the same repercussions that is in the pelvis, but with the simplex on top, you can add like a kind of chest of the torso. So it's like the first model that Dorothea was showing in her presentation. But we also get the time and the lucky to develop a torso or a thoracic arch. I don't know if you can see it here. Here you have the sternum and the spine. So this could be the ribs, and this could make for the rib cage. We use it like this for as a dorsal lumbar part, and we move it the other way around as a cervical and thoracic part. And by reading Tom Flemons' website, the intentiondesigns.ca, I understood that respecting the triangle, you could achieve maybe not better results, but yeah, easier results. So we linked, because we respect the triangles, we can link our structures one to another. And here we link the pelvis with the thoracic arch. This could be nearly closely than the first video that Dorothea showed us. I don't know if you can see here. The walking, well, you can see also that I am pushing it. And we also build, but I am not quite happy or finally happy with it. The pelvis, we call it the womb pelvis, which is like a kind of gynecologist pelvis. It doesn't have the legs, but you can see how the shape of the pelvis, respecting more anatomy. Sorry, because I didn't get the time to add the spine here on top, but you can see it is close or nearly close to Tom Flemons' model. And of course, I don't want to miss the time for introduce you that some of you for real know already, our Tensegrity Arty dog. There you have. Can you see it completely? Please, Arty, have a seat. Okay. Stand up, Arty. Hey. Freeze. Arty, so happy to see you. So I have more models, but I would like to leave some time for questions also. So as you can see, this amazing person was encouraging me to keep on building Tensegrities. So I think now is my time to encourage you to go to the intentiondesigns.ca website, also to the archive part, and enjoy and dive and explore all Tom Flemons' work and Dorothea's work also, because you're going to enjoy, you're going to learn a lot, and maybe you start building your Tensegrities.
Oh, thank you, Fernando and Dorothea, for introducing Tom Flemons' work to a much bigger audience. This is an excellent production, excellent presentations of yours. So I think we can open the field out now for invite people to take off their videos and open themselves out so we can see you, and any questions put in the chat, or and we'll see what we can do.
What we've had in the chat, Graham, is just a lot of accolades. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's wonderful. That's wonderful, wonderful. We love it. We love it. We love it. and not so much questions yet, but I'm going to be looking for them. I really appreciate the discussion. I appreciate everything. The discussion on the issues surrounding the terminology. And we saw that come up with our bilingual group a few weeks ago at the Tense BioLac group in Latin America that Christian and Andreina are part of, and they'll be here next week for the model zoo. And it's just so important and so many wonderful things. So I just want to say thank you, because this is amazing. And I don't care how long it's taken. You know, I mean, Dorothea, it went by so quickly. And Fernando, I always love seeing your models, of course, but I never really got to hear the personal story before. And so that was just wonderful. Mariana, I'm just going to say, since you're doing tech today, I think you can see some people are having trouble turning on their videos, and she's on it, guys.
I'm
She's
working.
on it. Yeah, go ahead,
I
Steve.
would really like to talk about Tom's humanity, because after I first dealt with him in the early, somewhere in the mid 90s, and I went out to visit him several times on Salt Spring Island, and the visits out there were just something very special. Salt Spring Island is a very special place. There are 12,000, I think, total inhabitants during the off season. The summertime builds up, but Tom was really, Tom didn't marry until he had a deathbed marriage, actually, but he never married until late in life. But he loved children, and he was a toy maker, and that's where he made enough money so he could play around with all the toys you see behind me. A lot of them are his. And one day I spent time in his house, and one day he had a bunch of kids over, and he set up catapults that he had built, and all these kids were firing catapults in his backyard. And these were just kids that come around from, well, his closest neighbor was several hundred yards away, but they come from miles away just to come and play in Tom's backyard with his catapults. And we'd go around the town, and he introduced me to, I thought he knew all 12,000 people on the island, because everybody knew him. And he introduced me around, and one day he just said, "Oh, let's have a lecture by you." And in 2 hours, he organized a lecture, and there were over 100 people on this island who came to hear me talk. They had no idea what I was talking about, but Tom Flemons said, "Come and listen," and they came. So he was a very special person.
Wow, that's amazing. I think Doug has something he wants to say too. Oh, Dorothea, did you have something you want to say, Dorothea? You can unmute, Dorothea.
Okay, I just briefly wanted to say, I wrote this in the chat, but I want it to be on YouTube as well, that any of you, if you received emails from Tom that would be good to add to the archive, please forward them to me, and it will be an easy and quick thing for me to add them to the archive, and a big pleasure to do so. So for example, I'm itching to get my hands on the emails that Fernando just referred to, where Tom was explaining about how to build a tensegrity foot and how to design it and so on. And so right now the archive only contains emails where I was a recipient, because that's all I had to put my hands on. And the other quick thing I want to mention is that Fernando is hatching a plan to translate the archive into Spanish. So very excited about that.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
All right. And hey, Doug, you can unmute and ask your question and chat.
Hi, wonderful, wonderful presentation. Really great. I've always wondered if Kenneth Snelson and Tom Flemons knew each other. I imagine that they did, and they would have had amazing conversations. And I expect you must know, Dorothea.
Actually, I don't know. I'm not aware of Tom telling me that he was clearly very influenced by Kenneth Snelson. Steve, do you know? You're muted.
Yeah, I'm just unmuting it. As far as I know, they never met. Tom was particularly wary of leaving his island, so he didn't travel much. And I don't think he ever met Snelson. I do think he corresponded on an occasion.
Other questions?
Well, I would be very interested if I found as I said at the beginning, I found last week's Tea Party so exciting because Jean-Claude Gumberto's videos are just so beautiful, and he's spent decades trying to make up theories to help explain them, and he's eager to collaborate with us, and we're eager to collaborate with him. And I was just wondering if, I just felt in watching the video from last week that Jean-Claude seemed a little bit frustrated that he wasn't able to articulate exactly what he thought should be done to continue expanding the biotensegrity theory. And that was my attempt to say, well, can we somehow combine these things to have the tensegrity structure and the fractalization and the randomness kind of together? And I don't know if anyone else has ideas about, do you think that's what Jean-Claude meant, or would it make sense to try to do that, or are there reasons not to do that? Jean-Claude was asking, could we create animations? And I mean, obviously, to actually make the animation takes a lot of technical know-how and programming and God knows what skills. But before then, we would have to figure out, have a vision for what is it we want to animate.
Well, I think this is great. And the fact that he articulated it, and Dorothea, the fact that you re-articulated it is great. Now, for me, the model already includes all of this, but I've been working with it for over a decade. So I don't know, I feel like it works for me that way. However, it's very clear that these different animations, they can have great value, right? And so one thing, Christian and Andreina, who are going to be on next week, their group, they do computer modeling, people in their group. And I know Gerald de Jong and his colleague, whose name I'm forgetting, I'm so sorry. It might be Joel, actually. That they also have been both building physical models, and Gerald does a whole lot with computer modeling. So I really look forward to some kind of a discussion developing across, all these voices. As you know, one of the goals with the Tea Party is for us to highlight all these different people working in these different areas. And what I'm really, really happy about is that it is getting so far beyond anything I can hold in my head, all the different people doing all the different things in all the different places. So it makes me really happy. And I love to see how Dorothea and Fernando have been working together on the archive, and I love on the Flemons Archive. And I love this idea of people forwarding their email from Tom, and so that you can expand that. Melanie, did you want to?
Could I just say that Jean-Claude and I have continued our discussion of last week. So we've been emailing back and forth, and so we haven't let it drop, and we are continuing, and we will work out something sooner or later. But yes, the problem that I see with animation is that you have to give them an algorithm to begin with in order for them to build an animation. And until we decide what that algorithm is, in a sense, they can't do anything. So it's an algorithmic kind of concept that we have to develop.
Well, at least, for example, the only real illustrations that I've seen for or last week when the topic of fractal came up was this was a completely deterministic, regular fractalization of the tensegrity icosahedron you showed. And at least that's one specific thing that could be done is let's at least create some stochastic or random fractalizations to illustrate. I mean, that's one specific thing that we clearly could do.
And there's a difference between irregularity and randomness. So I think it's never random because biology is always going for efficiency, but sometimes that results in irregularities. But that's another fabulous, huge to be had conversation, the whole thing on fractality. I think Melanie, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in.
Well, I just want to compliment Dorothea on just pulling that thread of showing how what's seemingly a disparate argument on the surface really has this really strong thread that that will tie all of these seeming arguments together. And I think you just from the beginning of summarizing last week's discussion all the way to your final slide, it was so beautiful. You just tied that together so well, and really thank you for putting that together in that way.
That's great. Now I have a note that Carol wants to say something. Is that Carol Boggs or Carol Davis?
Carol Davis.
Okay, Carol, go ahead. You're having, try again, Carol. Carol, something's going on with your audio. It's coming, it's like you're here coming from outer space, not just Maine. We'll try again. Talk to us, Carol. Try again.
I think it has to do with my, let's see here.
Carol, turn your speaker down on your computer if you can, because it might be a feedbacky kind of thing.
Can you hear me now?
A little, yeah, better. Go ahead. No, it's not working. Mariana, do you want to take Carol into a breakout room and see if you can help her?
We'll write something in the chat, Carol.
Yeah, not sure who's gonna take the hosting part, but
Yeah.
okay. So I'll go with her in a group. Okay, so I'll be back.
Okay. And meanwhile, we are flying free here without a pilot because Mariana's been our main tech person today. So I'll keep my eyes open. I think we have a small group, only 20 of us, 23. Anybody who wants to just unmute and pipe in, go ahead.
I wanted to ask, what is like the main challenge when it comes to mapping out the tensegrity of the human body? Is it because it starts at such a small level and then expands into more of like a larger level? Is that why?
Fernando, maybe you should take that. But you'll have to unmute. Or, well, okay, I'll start out.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I never get to build the whole body. As I said before, but really quick, we respect triangles in Artifact Pro. So what we did for the moment is link our structures one with each other, okay? But for example, the dog is not, how do you say, balance or what? The dog has a kind of extra rubber that makes the dog to be balanced, okay? But I think that when you build the whole body, yes, you need to do it. The tensions need to be balanced from the top to the bottom. So building parts separated and then link them together, that won't be, or that won't make to have the behavior that I think they need to have. So until I don't get to build the leg, which I am so scared about just the foot because it's an engineer bridge for me. I think I cannot reply your question, which is really interesting, but sorry, I cannot.
But
Also, something
Steve,
came to, I was gonna say something came to mind watching Dorothea's presentation today, and just learning about biotensegrity as a whole. Do you think that the tension and compression starts on a cellular level, and even that goes into play? So having those forces at a cellular level will even impact the forces on more of like the whole organism.
yeah, Gregory, exactly, I think. And Steve, I can tell you've got something to say. Steve, I've got a request as well. I want you to talk about broomsticks that kept breaking.
That's exactly what I was going to talk about.
All right.
You got models for you. When I first started back in the 80s and 90s, I started building these things myself. I never was good at it, so I was glad to turn it over to Tom when he had it. But I was building a model, and I said, I got to build a model of the whole body. So I had a pelvis, which this is one of Tom's pelvises, and I had a leg that I was building, and I was building him as tensegrity. So I had a tensegrity here, the tensegrity here, and the tensegrity as the hip joint, and the knee and the leg. And I said, well, I have to link them together. And they were very floppy up here. So Dorothea talked about how many tension elements you need. I said, well, I need to do something. So I put in an extra string here, a tension element, and it was the iliotibial band, of course, that I put in, and I recognized immediately that I was building the iliotibial band. And then I could actually, as I was stabilizing the top and the bottom, I could name the different tension structures I was putting in that exactly matched my anatomy that I knew. But what happened is that I did it, the compression forces kept increasing, and I had to keep making this stick thicker and thicker. I ended up with broomsticks that were the lay model, and the forces focused from the foot into the femur and from the hip into the femur, and this kept breaking. And of course, every time you did it, you had to redo the whole model, and it was taking me hours and hours and hours to do. So that's one of the things you have to recognize is how the forces localize in the body, and it all becomes, it just builds itself. It's amazing.
That's great. Thanks, Steve.
But for B-balance, that's what I wanted to say. For B-balance is, for example, the leg. This is the foot. Imagine, no? This is the foot. This is the rest of the leg. You need to build that the forces from the foot founds the knee, and also the knee founds the hip. But for example, in the knee, you need to have the compression forces, no? So the rubber bands that comes from the hip get to the bottom part of the knee, and then the forces that comes from the foot goes to the high part of the knee, so that you have both forces making the compression strength, okay, between the tension forces. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I think you need to do it, the whole structure balance by itself, because if you go and link one to each other, then you need to go and put extra cables for it to be balanced. Otherwise, you are just linking tensegrities, and that won't be balanced just like that. It's like a horse and a rider. It's not like you go on top and that's it. No, you have to get some attachments. The hands goes on the, I don't know how you call it in English, and your foot goes on the chair. I don't know how to say in English also.
And of course, yes, so we want the transfer of forces all the way through the system. And then the other thing is the model can never be a body, right? So we're always we're learning from the models, we're making the models, but they can never be the thing that we're trying to model.
Yeah, Dorothea snapshots. I think that's a nice word, Dorothea. I like it.
Yeah, Carol is ready now.
Great. Yes. Carol Davis.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah.
Okay. I apologize. Actually, the person who spoke for me before me, I think her name was Melanie, spoke for me too. And I wanted to spotlight Dorothea's starting out the way she did. To me, the important thing is finding the language that satisfies the people who really have a good sense of what this truth really is that we're trying to describe, have a vision. And Carol Boggs and I were just exchanging on the chat. She said, I really like thinking of tensegral models as samples of force vectors rather than atomic modeling. And I said, me too. I get a little distracted by the model from my vision of what's illustrating. And the thing that I really wanted to point out to Dorothea was the way you took the words that Jean-Claude was saying, and then you had your vision of what he was trying to talk about, and what Steve has talked about, and what the other, and Graham and Susan and the other Biotensegrity writers have talked about. And you took the words and you said, now how can we find a way to bring these words together so that everyone is satisfied with the meanings that are being conveyed by the language? And just like the old language of stretch and slide or glide, and when people say, well, slide or glide doesn't make much difference to me, but it really does, because when you slide, you have resistance, you have an impediment to the movement. But when you glide, it's smooth. And the impediment to the movement is the old paradigm, the old biokinesiology model. The glide is the Jean-Claude under the skin model. And everything is fluid and constantly moving, from not just the cellular level, Gregory, but all the way down to the atomic level, the atoms that make up the cells, that make up the organs, that make up the parenchyma, that make up the fascia. Everything is push-pull, everything is compression, tension, and it's always changing. And to me, that's really the dynamic that needs to be captured as closely as possible, not just in the models, but in the language that we use, so that we don't go backwards into the old paradigm. We move forward into this new paradigm of holistic embodied health. That's the way we need to be moving in this century for healthcare.
Thank you, Carol. That was
Thank you.
fitting. Now we're coming up towards the 2-hour mark. So unless anybody else has got anything specific to say, Susan, I can't hear you, Susan.
Carol Boggs, do you mind pitching in with your comment too? Because I thought it was interesting. About
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I really get excited when I see models that emulate what the body's doing. The problem for me is if I can stay away from trying to see the model as mimicking the anatomy and really see it as expressing force vectors, and therefore not looking so much like anatomy, I think it gets, maybe it will be a little bit easier to help the science community that is resistant to our way of thinking embrace things. If they understand this isn't supposed to look like, this isn't what your back looks like, this isn't what your hip looks like. But we have to look at it from a force vector point of view. So that was what that idea was.
I think you're actually right, because there are so many different models, and each model represents something. So they all have a value in the right context. And I think that it's important we recognize the context that we introduce each model to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right.
The thing, I'm still in this struggle in my community with figuring out how to approach and soften Patrick Johnson's debunking of Biotensegrity piece on YouTube. So, any way I can start to turn things so that I can find a better way in, I'm looking for that.
Yes, appreciate it.
And Carol, I think a number of people probably would would be happy to work with you on that, or already working on that. You saw maybe Sergio Fonseca's response to the video.
I did.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and there are actually 2 of those videos up there, which is
Oh.
interesting.
Oh,
There's
Patrick did too?
Yeah, there's an older one that my husband found like a week and a half ago. I think it's an older one.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you. And yeah, and it's not about just getting in and saying you're wrong. It's about, with all of these things, it's about having a nice collegial scholarly discussion.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to just say, since I'm chatting right now, I want to thank our sponsors once again, Artifact Pro, and Fernando, thanks also for telling us the story of Artifact Pro today, and also for sponsoring us every week. It's wonderful. Handspring Publishing, who's done so much for so many of us. So many of us have worked for Handspring. They were so patient with me, taking 5 years to write a book. Elizabeth Larkham, who may still be on right now, has a weekly show that it's been really amazing when you can see it, and then it streams to YouTube if you can't see it at the time it's on. But if you get on the Handspring email list, you'll get notification of that. British Fascist Symposium has some great stuff coming up that you'll hear about soon. And Embodied Biotensegrity also has an ongoing, amazingly useful and informative and helpful, both a book club and a movement mentors monthly session, and a lot of other stuff going on. So check out Embodied Biotensegrity. And Chris, are you here now?
She is.
I am, yeah. Hi.
How's Yap's course going?
Oh my gosh, it's fantastic. I in fact am hoping to be able to meet with some of you and just chat about it after we're done. There's so much things that he's talking about, you know, the performance of embryology, and I'm thinking of the performance of math, and how do we take that and really, for the movers, we already are, the performance as a way of learning biotensegrity.
Wow, that's great.
And one of the things he said was, it's not instead of the science, it's a contribution, you know, it's another entry in. So.
All right, and let's see, Jan's around, and get on Jan's mailing list. That's the, thank you, Chris. That's the, I'm just seeing a note from Jan. That is the British Fascist Symposium. Jan, are you still here? Did you want to say something?
Hi, I can do if you want. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, jump in. It's a party. It's a party.
Thank you. Well, it's just that the British Fascist Symposium is spreading its wings, and we're going to be doing a lot more interesting stuff, all fascia focused, with a heavy biotensegrity bias, of course, because of the way I believe, you know, I think, same as you guys. So if you'd like to know what we're up to, if you can go to the British Fascist Symposium, the fasciastsymposium.co.uk, and sign up to be on the mailing list, then you'll get to hear. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jan. All right, Graham, up to you.
Well, thank you to all, and particularly to Dorothea and Fernando for bringing this work of Tom Flemons, who's really important stuff. And talking about models puts me in Tensegrity heaven. So it's been a wonderful couple of hours. Thank you so much. Next week, we're going to be talking about another model zoo with Bruce Hamilton, who's a top-notch Tensegrity model maker, amongst many other things, together with Christiane Castro and June Kwok and some others who'll be talking about Tensegrity models. And I would take the opportunity now to say, if you've all got Tensegrity models, then bring them along to the zoo. At least you can hold them up in the air and wave them if you don't talk about each one individually. But if you haven't made a Tensegrity model yet, there's plenty of information on mine and Susan's and websites and YouTube as well. So before we go,
Graham, and if people have interesting things they've been doing with Tensegrity that are sort of out of the box, I know Mariana's been doing a lot of that.
Great, bring them along and make a note in the chat next week, and we'll try and get you included. So the final thing, of course, being a Biotensegricosta tea party, is to have a toast. And I wonder if you'd mind doing it again for us, Dorothea. You have to unmute you. Let's see.
Unmute. Yes, Fernando, maybe we can make a toast together, and Steve and everyone who had the pleasure to meet Tom Flemons either in person or via email. He was a wonderful man, and he's still with us in spirit. And thank you for today and for this whole community. Cheers.
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 Ambe.
Fernando, you need to unmute.
I would like to toast also because of for Tom Flemons, and like he will say, a big hug with intention.
Amen to that.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you next week.
Yes.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.